Good afternoon. Today I shall be giving you a brief introduction to metaphysical poetry and give you an idea as to what constitutes the chief characteristics of metaphysical poetry. Now, critics have been in much more general agreement about who the principal 17th century metaphysical poets were than about what constitutes the metaphysicalness, as it were, of metaphysical poetry. But fortunately, this general agreement provides valuable clues as to an understanding of both the 17th century and modern conceptions of metaphysical poetry. Now, metaphysical elements have been recognized in the work of Sidney, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Chapman, and other English and continental poets long before John Donne wrote his poetry. However, the most representative metaphysical poets, as we know them today, were John Donne, Edward Herbert, George Herbert, Townshend, Henry King. A significant number of poems that he wrote distinctly had a metaphysical slant, John Cleveland, Andrew Marvell, Abraham Cowley, and Richard Crashaw. In the work of Henry Vaughan and Traherne, there are some important metaphysical elements, but other qualities which are so pronounced in the other poets were somehow absent in them. Many later 16th century poets wrote some more or less metaphysical poetry. For example, Sidney's 29th sonnet, which begins with "like some weak lords," depends on an extended metaphysical conceit, and his "in a grove most rich of shade" suggests clearly John Donne's ecstasy. Shakespeare's sonnets 44, 45, 87, 134, and to a great extent 137 have pronounced metaphysical characteristics. Both Marlowe and Chapman employed metaphysical conceits significantly and frequently in their Hero and Leander. Also, in Ovid's Banquet of Sense, Chapman sometimes expressed the emotional in terms of abstract relationships and scientific processes. Now, John Donne was the leavening force in the rise of the style and its most consistent and extreme adherent. His poetry abounds in probing analogies and ingenious wit, and recent critics have found in Donne their most prized examples of ambiguity and the unified sensibility. Following Donne's lead, Edward and George Herbert helped establish respectively the secular and devotional lines in metaphysical poetry. In his structures and figures, Edward Herbert, who praised the expression of common things ingeniously and wittily, quote unquote, and somewhat out of the ordinary road, quote unquote again, resembled John Donne more closely than any of his other followers. Cowley and Cleveland marked two successive steps towards forfeiture of meaning for the sake of what we know today as wit, and incidentally toward a broader and less aristocratic popularity. Marvell, whose tone is often closer to that of Lovelace and of the Cavalier Platonists than to Donne's, absorbed the metaphysical style with an easy grace into his own. George Herbert channeled the metaphysical style into a true devotional poetry. Like John Donne, he married a careful logic to a metaphorical vision. Both Donne and Herbert depended in their figures on abstract knowledge and everyday experience. However, Herbert's work smells less of the lamp than Donne's and has more of the freshness of the garden and the sanctity of the chapel, as it were. Crashaw stood apart. His metaphysical style is often intertwined with the continental Catholic Baroque style, his poetic structures are frequently loose, almost epigrammatic, while his conceits tend to depend on an all-suffusing sensuous and emotive appeal rather than on aptness and precision. All of these poets contributed to the development of the style known today as metaphysical. Now, what differentiates the poetry of the metaphysicals from the corpus of poetry produced by their contemporaries is perhaps the effusion of logic and metaphor in their poems. During the Renaissance, many writers forged new links between its rhetoric and logic. Thomas Wilson, for example, wrote in his The Art of Rhetoric, and I quote, "I wish that every man should desire and seek to have his logic perfect, and therefore he looked to profit in rhetoric, considering the ground and conformation of causes is for the most part gathered out of logic." Unquote. Part of the new interest in logic was due to Peter Ramus, an influential French Renaissance humanist and rhetorician who, in his drastic revision of Aristotle's rhetoric, stressed the subordination of other sciences to logic and greatly simplified the logical processes of investigation and disposition. There was a new emphasis upon the so-called figures of thought, such as definition, distinction, cause and effect, comparison, example, dilemma, and the imaginary dialogue, which could be dealt with under the heads of logic. These figures of thought were distinguished from the figures of words, treating chiefly tropes and schemes, including spelling, diction, syntax, and devices for arousing emotion. Logical disposition, figures of thought, and the metaphysical conceit flourished in the logic-conscious Renaissance climate. Writings familiar to the metaphysical poets would have given them considerable support, that is theoretical support for their conceits. In fact, Aristotle could be regarded as the father of the conceit in Renaissance age. He stressed the need for appropriateness in figures, but he also emphasized in his rhetoric the pleasure given by strangeness, originality, and surprise. He approved metaphors derived from well-constructed enigmas and explained that it is proper to derive metaphors from objects which are closely related to the thing itself, but which are not immediately obvious. I repeat, not immediately obvious. As in philosophy, he says, it is a mark of sagacity to discern resemblances in things which are widely different. Much of the conceits of the metaphysical poetry can be theoretically traced to Renaissance criticism, which recognized and partly defined and even dictated its liking for the kind of metaphor that has come to be regarded as metaphysical conceit. The metaphor that connected logically subjects not obviously analogous or similar, and that often linked different levels in the great chain of being. The Renaissance concern with this kind of metaphor was apparently largely the product of the intense interest in the theory of correspondences. The theory assumed that there were intimate, interlocking relationships between the heavens, the earth, the body politic, and man, all of which were an expression of God. Because God, man, and nature were joined together through the incarnation and the Eucharist, one could find sacramental and incarnational symbols in the world. Analogies between the infinite and the finite were justified by dogma. In the incarnation, God had become man, who himself contained in small the earth and its mineral, vegetable, and animal realms. Through the Eucharist, too, partakers were felt to be united with each other, with Christ, and thus with God. The union living and continuous, was embodied in history. These mysteries justified not only the discovery of divine symbols, but also the use of surprising unions achieved through metaphors, paradoxes, comparisons, and puns. It is highly important for metaphysical poetry that the system of correspondences both inspired further analogical reasoning and provided the methods and tools for it. Since correspondences were regarded as both literal and meaningful, logical analogy could be of thought as well as an expression of the instrument for discovering the truth. The metaphysical conceit was apparently a product of the Renaissance tendency to discover similarities, significant analogies, almost everywhere in existence. As the heart was sometimes regarded as the body's sun, only a slight departure from an accepted idea would lead to the construction of a conceit around the idea that true love, or even a mistress, is the poet's son. Sometimes, as in the best of Donne and Andrew Marvell, this analogizing produced true insights of a very high creative order. While a dependence on a system of correspondences was common to most Renaissance thinkers, it is at the core of much metaphysical poetry that we read today, and is one of the most important characteristics of the metaphysical style, contributing to various witty devices beside the conceit. The metaphysical poet's weakness for wit can also be traced to Renaissance rhetorical theory. It was Aristotle who had recommended a decorous use of most of the elements conventionally attributed to wit, such as surprise, deception, antithesis, and the pun. He was interested in wit as a stylistic device that could enliven and make more effective the matter in hand, and was aware of its close relationship to an underlying logic. He pointed out that the antithetical style was pleasant because contraries could be more easily understood when juxtaposed, and he approved of unexpected puns that expressed a truth. So these roughly are the theoretical backgrounds which one has to keep in mind when one reads the poems of the metaphysical poets, chiefly John Donne and Andrew Marvell. Thank you.